During the Italian campaign of 1943, 130,000 Free French soldiers fought on the Allied side, and by the time of the Normandy invasion, Free French forces numbered approximately 500,000 regulars and more than 100,000 French forces of the interior (FFI). The Free French 2nd Armored Division, under General Philippe Leclerc, landed in Normandy, and in the waning days of summer 1944, led the drive toward Paris. The FFI in Normandy and the Île-de-France region surrounding Paris began to harass German forces intensively, cutting roads and railways, setting ambushes and fighting conventional battles alongside their allies. The Free French 2nd Armored Division, numbering 14,000 men, rolled ashore in Normandy on 1 August 1944 and served under General Patton's Third Army. The division played a critical role in Operation Cobra, the Allies' breakout from its Normandy beachhead, where it served as a link between American and Canadian armies and made rapid progress against German forces. The 2nd Armored all but destroyed the 9th Panzer Division and mauled several other German units as well. During the battle for Normandy, this German division lost 133 killed, 648 wounded, and 85 missing. The division's material losses included 76 armored vehicles, 7 cannons, 27 half-tracks, and 133 other vehicles. Free French generals Henry Giraud left, and Charles de Gaulle sit down after shaking hands in the presence of Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill at the Casablanca Conference on 14 January 1943. The most celebrated moment in the unit's history involved the liberation of Paris. Allied strategy emphasized destroying German forces retreating towards the Rhine, but when the French resistance under Henry Raltanguy staged an uprising in the city, de Gaulle, upon receiving intelligence that the French resistance had openly risen up against the German occupiers, and unwilling to allow his countrymen to be slaughtered against the entrenched and better-armed Germans, as had happened to the Polish resistance in the Warsaw Uprising, petitioned Eisenhower for an immediate frontal assault. He threatened to detach the French 2nd Armored Division, 2 EDB, and order them to single-handedly attack Paris, bypassing the SHAEF chain of command if he delayed approval unduly. Eisenhower relented, and Leclerc's forces headed toward Paris. After hard fighting that cost the 2nd Division 35 tanks, 6 self-propelled guns, and 111 vehicles, Dietrich von Koltitz, the military governor of Paris, surrendered the city in a ceremony at the Hotel Muris. Jubilant crowds greeted the French forces, and de Gaulle led a renowned victory parade through the city. On 15 August 1944, and in the following days, during Operation Dragoon, 230,000 Free French soldiers under Général de Lattre de Tassigny took part in the invasion of southern France alongside American troops, in order to secure the vital ports on the French Mediterranean coast and increase pressure on the German forces by opening another front, 195, hindered by Allied air supremacy and a large-scale uprising by the French resistance. The weak German forces were swiftly defeated, and southern France liberated by Free French and American troops. De Gaulle not only kept the patriotic resistance alive, he also did everything possible to re-establish the French claim to independence and sovereignty. As a leader, the American and British governments preferred the less popular, but less abrasively vindictive, General Giraud to de Gaulle, but for the French population de Gaulle was almost universally recognized as the true leader in their victory. These events forced Roosevelt to recognize, finally and fully, the provisional government installed in France by de Gaulle. Communist prisoner in France, July 1944. Artist's impression of a meeting of the PCF, Parti Communiste Français, Central Committee at Longjumeau, 1943. Left to right, Benoit Frachon, Auguste Lecoeur, Jacques Duclos, and Charles Tillon. After the signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the outbreak of World War II in 1939, the French Communist Party, PCF, was declared a proscribed organization by Edouard Daladier's government. 196. Many of its leaders were arrested and imprisoned or forced to go underground. 197. The PCF adopted an anti-war position on orders of the Comintern in Moscow, 59-198, which remained in place for the first year of the German occupation. Reflecting the September 1939 non-aggression pact between Germany and the USSR. 199. Conflicts erupted within the party, as many of its members opposed collaboration with the Germans, while others toed the party line of neutrality as directed by Stalin in Moscow. 197-200. On Armistice Day, November 11, 1940. Communists were among the university students demonstrating against German repression by marching along the Champs-Élysées. 201. It was only when Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941 that French communists actively began to organize a resistance effort. 202-203. They benefited from their experience in clandestine operations during the Spanish Civil War. 197. On 21 August 1941, Colonel Pierre Georges Fabian committed the first overt violent act of communist resistance by assassinating a German officer at the Barbes Rochechouart station of the Paris Metro. 204. The attack, and others perpetrated in the following weeks, provoked fierce reprisals, culminating in the execution of 98 hostages after the Feldcommandant of Nantes was shot on 20 October. 81. The military strength of the Communists was still relatively feeble at the end of 1941, but the rapid growth of the Frankstyrers et Partisans, FTP, a radical armed movement, ensured that French communists regained their reputation as an effective anti-fascist force. 205. The FTP was open to non-communists, but operated under communist control. 206. With its members predominantly engaged in acts of sabotage and guerrilla warfare. 207. By 1944, the FTP had an estimated strength of 100,000 men. 208. Towards the end of the occupation, the PCF reached the height of its influence, controlling large areas of France through the resistance units under its command. Some in the PCF wanted to launch a revolution as the Germans withdrew from the country. 209. But the leadership, acting on Stalin's instructions, opposed this and adopted a policy of cooperating with the Allied powers and advocating a new popular front government. 210. During the Nazi occupation of France, the French Trotskyist group Parti Ouvrier Internationaliste printed the clandestine magazine Arbeiter und Soldat, Worker and Soldier, for German troops. The publication opposed both fascism and Western imperialism, and 12 issues were distributed from July 1943 through July 1944. 211-212. Many well-known intellectual and artistic figures were attracted to the Communist Party during the war, including the artist Pablo Picasso and the writer and philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. 213. Philosophers Georges Politzer and Valentin Feldman and writer Jacques Decoeur were among others. After the German invasion of the USSR, many Russian white immigrants, inspired by Russian patriotic sentiment, would support the Soviet war effort. A number of them formed the Union of Russian Patriots, which adopted pro-Soviet positions and collaborated closely with the French Communist Party. Socialist. This section needs additional citations for verification. Please help improve this article by adding citations to reliable sources in this section. Unsourced material may be challenged and removed. January 2013. Learn how and when to remove this message. At the end of the summer of 1940, Daniel Mayer was asked by Leon Blum to reconstitute the SFIO, in ruins because of Paul Fora's defection to the Vichy regime. In March 1940, one Daniel Mayer created with other socialists like Suzanne Buisson and Félix Gouin, the Comité d'Action Socialiste, CAS, in Nimes. The same thing was created by Jean-Baptiste Lebas in the Nord-Pas-de-Calais, administratively joined with Belgium, in January 1941, along the lines of a prior network created in September 1940. In 1942, Le Populaire, newspaper of the SFIO from 1921 to 1940, was publishing again, clandestinely. The same year, André Philippe became Commissaire National à l'Intérieur of the Free French, France Libre, and Félix Gouin joined Charles de Gaulle in London to represent the socialists. In Algeria, left-wing networks of resistance were already formed. As the Riom trial began in 1942, the fervor and the number of socialists in the resistance grew. The Casse-Sud became the secret SFIO in March 1943. There was a majority from the SFIO in Liberation Nord, one of the 8 great networks to make up the National Council of the Resistance, and in the Brutus network. Socialists were also important in the Organisation Civile et Militaire, OCM, and in Liberation Sud. Other socialist leaders in the resistance included Pierre Brossolette, Gaston de Ferra, Jean Biondi, Jules Moch, Jean-Pierre Bloch, Tanguy Prigent, Guy Mollet, and Christian Pinot. François Camel and Marx Dorme were assassinated, while Jean-Baptiste Lebas, Isidore Thivrier, Amédée Dunois, Claude Jordery, and Augustin Malraux died during their deportation. Vichy nationalist. Before the war, there were several ultra-rightist organizations in France. Another among the most influential factions of the right was Croix de Feu, Cross of Fire, 214, which gradually moderated its positions during the early years of the war and grew increasingly popular among the aging veterans of the First World War, 215. Despite some differences in their positions on certain issues, these organizations were united in their opposition to parliamentarism, 216, a stance that had led them to participate in demonstrations, most notably the political disturbance riots of 6 February 1934, 217. At about the same time, La Cagoule, a fascist paramilitary organization, launched various actions aimed at destabilizing the Third Republic. These efforts continued until La Cagoule could be infiltrated and dismantled in 1937. 218. Thousands not only welcomed the Vichy regime, 219, but collaborated with it to one degree or another. But the powerful appeal of French nationalism drove others to engage in resistance against occupying German forces. In 1942, after an ambiguous period of collaboration, the former leader of Croix de Feu, François de la Roque, founded the Clan Network, which provided information to the British intelligence services. 220. Georges Laustin-Alaco and Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, who had both supported La Cagoule, founded the Alliance Network, and Colonel Georges Groussard Fr of the Vichy Secret Services founded the Gilbert Network. Some members of Action Française engaged in the resistance with similar nationalistic motives. Some prominent examples are Daniel Cordier, who became Jean Moulin's secretary, and Colonel Ramey, who founded the Confrérie Notre Dame. These groups also included Pierre de Bénouville, who, together with Henri Frenay, led the Combat Group, and Jacques Renouvin, who founded the group of resistors known as Liberté. Sometimes contact with others in the resistance led some operatives to adopt new political philosophies. Many gradually moved away from their anti-Semitic prejudices and their hatred of démocratie, dirty democracy, which many equated with mob rule, or simply away from their traditional grassroots conservatism. Bénouville and Marie-Madeleine Fourcade became députés in the French Parliament after the war. François Mitterrand moved towards the left, joined the resistance, and eventually became the first socialist president of the Fifth Republic. Henri Frenay evolved towards European socialism, 221, and Daniel Cordier, whose family had supported Charles Maurras for 3 generations, abandoned his views in favor of the ideology of the Republican Jean Moulin. The historian Jean-Pierre Azéma coined the term Vichisto-raciste to describe those who at first supported the Vichy regime, mostly based on the patriotic image of Pétain rather than the Révolution nationale, but later joined the resistance. 222, the founder of Ceux de la Libération, those of the liberation, Maurice Ripoche, initially defended Vichy but soon placed the liberation of France above all other goals, and in 1941 opened his movement to leftists. In contrast, many extreme right-wing members of the resistance, such as Gabriel Jean-Tet and Jacques Leroy-Ladurie, never renounced their tolerant attitudes towards Vichy. Affiche Rouge. The Affiche Rouge, red placard, was a famous propaganda poster distributed by the Vichy French and German authorities in the spring of 1944 in occupied Paris. It was intended to discredit a group of 23 franc-tireurs known as the Manouchian Group. After its members were arrested, tortured, and publicly tried, they were executed by firing squad in Fort Mont-Valérien on 21 February 1944. The poster emphasized the composition of the group's membership, many of whom were Jews and communists, to discredit the resistance as not French enough in its fundamental allegiance and motivations. 223. Jews. Ariadna Scriabina, daughter of Russian composer Alexander Scriabin, co-founded the Armée Juive and was killed by the pro-Nazi milice in 1944. She was posthumously awarded the Croix de Guerre and Médaille de la Résistance. The Vichy regime had legal authority in both the north of France, which was occupied by the German Wehrmacht, and the southern Free Zone, where the regime's administrative center, Vichy, was located. 224-225, Vichy voluntarily and willfully collaborated with Nazi Germany. 226, and adopted a policy of persecution towards Jews, demonstrated by the passage of anti-Semitic legislation as early as October 1940. The law on the status of Jews, which legally redefined French Jews as a non-French underclass, deprived them of citizenship. 227-228, according to Philippe Pétain's chief of staff, Germany was not at the origin of the anti-Jewish legislation of Vichy. That legislation was spontaneous and autonomous. 229, the laws led to confiscations of property, arrests, and deportations to concentration camps. 230, as a result of the fate promised them by Vichy and the Germans, Jews were overrepresented at all levels of the French resistance. Studies show that although Jews in France constituted only 1% of the French population, they comprised approximately 15–20% of the resistance. 230, one among these were many Jewish immigrés, such as Hungarian artists and writers. 232. The Jewish youth movement Éclaireuses et Éclaireurs Israélites de France, EEIF, equivalent to Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts in other countries, had, during the early years of the occupation, shown support for the traditional values of the Vichy regime. 233, until it was banned in 1943, after which its older members soon formed armed resistance units. 234. A militant Jewish Zionist resistance organization, the Jewish Army Armée Juive, was founded in 1942. It was established and led by Abraham Polonsky, Eugenie Polonsky, Lucian Lublin. 235, David Naut and Ariadna Scriabina. 236, daughter of the Russian composer Alexander Scriabin. 237, they continued armed resistance under a Zionist flag until liberation finally arrived. The Armée Juive organized escape routes across the Pyrenees to Spain and smuggled about 300 Jews out of the country during 1943–1944. They distributed millions of dollars from the American Joint Distribution Committee to relief organizations and fighting units within France. 238. In 1944, the EIF and the Jewish Army combined to form the Organisation Juive de Combat, OJC. The OJC had 400 members by the summer of 1944, 234, and participated in the liberations of Paris, Lyon, Toulouse, Grenoble, and Nice. 239. In the southern occupation zone, the Œuvre de Secours aux Enfants, roughly, Children's Relief Effort, a French Jewish humanitarian organization commonly called OSC, saved the lives of between 7,000 and 9,000 Jewish children by forging papers, smuggling them into neutral countries, and sheltering them in orphanages, schools, and convents. 240. Armenians. Misak Manoukian portrait on the Affiche Rouge, arrested and were shot near Paris on 21 February 1944. Considered a hero of the French resistance. The Armenian community of France played an active role in the resistance. 241-242, Armenian poet and communist Misak Manoukian, became one of the leaders of the French resistance and commander of the Manoukian group. The family of Charles Aznavour had supported Misak and his wife Mélinée when they were in hiding. Arpin Tavishan, another executed member of the Manoukian group, industrialist Napoleon Bouloukian, 1905-1984, poets Kagem Atmagian, 1910-1940, and Raubin Melik were other famous participants in the French resistance. The anti-fascist underground patriotic organization was also commanded by Armenian officers. Armenian-French writer Louise Aslanian, 1906-1945, another French resistance activist, was arrested along with her husband Arper Aslanian on July 24, 1944, taken to the Nazi concentration camps 243 by Nazis and killed in 1945. Many of Louise's manuscripts and diaries were confiscated and destroyed by Nazis. 244. Resistors Alexander Kazarian and Barduk Petrosian were awarded by the highest military orders of France by General Charles de Gaulle. 245. Henry Carrion, 1921-2011, a member of the Manoukian group, participated in illegal distribution of El Humanité in Paris and was engaged in armed struggle until the liberation. 246. In 2012, 95-year-old Arsene Tchakarian, the last survivor of the Manoukian resistance group who fought against occupying Nazi German forces during the Second World War, was decorated as Officer of the Legion of Honor by the President of France. 247. Georgians. Dimitri Amalek-Vari with Free France Legionnaires in French Morocco, 1941. Georgians living in France and the French colonies and people of Georgian ethnicity played an active and symbolic role in the French resistance. One of the most renowned figures of the Free French forces was Prince Dimitri Amalek-Vari, who participated in every important operation that involved French forces until 1942, and led the Legion Étrangère into battle in the Norwegian and later African campaigns against Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. 248. Under General Koenig, he and his heavily outnumbered troops committed daring raids, dealing decisive losses to the Germans at the Battle of Bir Hakeim. 249. During the battle he is said to have written, "We, foreigners, have only one way to prove to France our gratitude: to be killed." General de Gaulle personally awarded Amalek-Vari the Order of Liberation and posthumously named him and his men the Honor of France. 250. He was also known by the French populace as Bazorka. 251. The lieutenant colonel was one of the 66 French recipients of the Norwegian War Cross and was also posthumously awarded the Legion of Honor. He led his troops by example and died in combat during the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. Citation needed. Another known resistance fighter was Begler Samkaradze, a captured Soviet soldier who was transferred to France where he escaped and joined the resistance. Upon return to his homeland, he was imprisoned by Soviet authorities on charges of high treason, but two commanders of the French resistance testified to his commitment in the fight against Nazi Germany. 252. Women. Further information: Women in the French resistance. Nicole Minet, a French partisan who captured 25 Nazis in the Chartres area, August 1944. Although inequalities persisted under the Third Republic, the cultural changes that followed the First World War allowed differences in the treatment of men and women in France to narrow gradually. 253, with some women assuming political responsibilities as early as the 1930s. The defeat of France in 1940 and the appointment of the Vichy regime's conservative leader, Philippe Pétain, undermined feminism. 254, and France began a restructuring of society based on the femme au foyer, or women at home, imperative. 255, on at least one occasion, Pétain spoke out to French mothers about their patriotic duty. Mothers of France, our native land, yours is the most difficult task but also the most gratifying. You are, even before the state, the true educators. You alone know how to inspire in all our youth the inclination for work, the sense of discipline, the modesty, the respect that give men character and make nations strong. 256. Despite opposing the collaborationist regime, the French resistance generally sympathized with its anti-feminism and did not encourage the participation of women in war and politics. Following, in the words of historian Henry Nagers, a notion of inequality between the sexes as old as our civilization and as firmly implanted in the resistance as it was elsewhere in France. 257. Consequently, women in the resistance were less numerous than men and averaged only 11% of the members in the formal networks and movements. 258-259. Madeleine Raffaud recalled, as a 19-year-old courier for the FTP, cross at being told always to carry weapons across town for the men to use. 260. She secured permission to use a gun herself, and 23 July 1944, in broad daylight on a bridge overlooking the River Seine, shot a lone German NCO. After being arrested and tortured unsuccessfully for her contacts, she was released in a prisoner exchange, negotiated by the Swedish consul Raoul Nordling, and she returned immediately to the struggle. On 23 August, she commanded an FTP operation that trapped a train in the Buttes-Chaumont tunnel and secured the surrender of the 80 German soldiers aboard. 261. On the 25th, she also took part in an attack on the barracks on Place de la République. 262. Yet, after the liberation of Paris, she was unable to finish the war with the rest of her resistance group, now part of the regular French army. At a time when women in France did not yet have the right to vote, she was told that she did not have her father's permission. 260. Some of the women involved in the resistance did assume prominent roles. 263 intellectuals like Germaine Tillion and Suzanne Hiltermann-Solaumiak, highly aware of the signification of Nazism and collaboration, were among the few early resistants. Suzanne Hiltermann-Solaumiak played an important role in the Dutch Paris movement, specialized in rescuing Allied pilots. Lucy Aubrac, the iconic resistor and co-founder of Liberation Sud, was never assigned a specific role in the hierarchy of the movement. 263. Hélène Vianney, one of the founders of Défense de la France and married to a man who shared her political views, was never permitted to express her opinions in the underground newspaper, and her husband took 2 years to arrive at political conclusions she had held for many years. 264. Marie-Madeleine Fourcade, the only major female leader in the resistance, headed the Alliance Network. 265. The Organisation Civile et Militaire had a female wing headed by Marie-Hélène Lefaucheux. 266, who took part in setting up the Œuvre de Sainte-Foy to assist prisoners in French jails and German concentration camps. 267, but no women were chosen to lead any of the 8 major resistance movements. After the liberation of France, the provisional government appointed no women ministers or commissaires de la République. 268, however, as head of the provisional government of the French Republic, General de Gaulle, as a recognition of and a reward for their role in the resistance, granted women the right to vote in 1945. Terminology. Charles de Gaulle spoke of French resistance in his broadcast on 18 June 1940, 269, English-language use of the phrase, the resistance, in reference to French anti-Axis activity dates back to at least 1944, 270. Boris Kovalyov has stated that the resistance movement in France and its name originated among white movement Russian immigrés. 271. The Russian Boris Vilde co-founded one of the first anti-occupation groups, and in December 1940 started co-publishing the underground newspaper Resistance. Networks and movements. Main article, list of networks and movements of the French resistance. A volunteer of the French Resistance Interior Force, FFI, at Chédedon in 1944. In this context, it is customary to distinguish the various organizations of the French resistance as movements or networks. A resistance network was an organization created for a specific military purpose, usually intelligence gathering, sabotage, or aiding Allied aircrews who had been shot down behind enemy lines. 272-273. A resistance movement, on the other hand, was focused on educating and organizing the population. 273, i.e., to raise awareness and organize the people as broadly as possible. 272. BCRA networks. Further information, Operation Jedburgh. German military and resistance in Brittany, July 1944. German military and resistance, July 1944. In July 1940, after the defeat of the French armies and the consequent armistice with Germany, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill asked the Free French government in exile, headed by General Charles de Gaulle, to set up a secret service agency in occupied France to counter the threat of a German operation codenamed Operation Sea Lion, the expected cross-channel invasion of Britain. Colonel André Duovrin, also known as Colonel Passy, who had previously worked for France's military intelligence service, the Duxim Bureau, took on the responsibility for creating such a network. Its principal goal was to inform London of German military operations on the Atlantic coast and in the English Channel. 274. The spy network was called the Bureau Central de Renseignements et d'Action, BCRA, and its actions were carried out by volunteers who were parachuted into France to create and nourish local resistance cells. 275. Of the nearly 2,000 volunteers who were active by the end of the war, one of the most effective and well-known was the agent Gilbert Renault, who was awarded the Ordre de la Libération and later the Legion of Honor for his deeds. 276. Known mainly by the pseudonym Colonel Raymond, he returned to France in August 1940, not long after the surrender of France, where the following November he organized one of the most active and important resistance networks of the BCRA, the Confrérie de Notre Dame, Brotherhood of Our